today, and I wanted to welcome you to the New America Foundation. We are a public policy institute, a think tank here in D.C., doing a lot of work. We've got about 12 different programs doing everything from foreign policy analysis to healthcare reform. And my name is Sasha Meinrath, and I direct the Open Technology Initiative here at the New America Foundation. We're sort of the technology telecom arm of the foundation's work. And as you can imagine, when Jed Kolko and I first started talking, and he was mentioning that he's doing this in-depth econometric analysis of the effects of broadband on the economic viability of different communities, this was of great interest to us. And he's actually come out all the way from California, from the Public Policy Institute of California, to present to you today. I, in many ways, am really thankful to have a fantastic group of folks here today. So Jed has been the Associate Director of Research for PPIC and has been sort of toiling away over on the other coast, and we have him out here today to present what I think is a really fantastic report. We've also got Joanne Hovis, who's right up here up front, who is hailing as President-elect of NATOA and has done tremendous work both there and as the President of CTCnet, which has done a lot of consulting work with municipalities across, I think it's over 150 different towns and cities all across the United States, working on deploying broadband within their communities. And we've also have my policy analyst, Ben Lennett, who is a policy wonk extraordinaire and has been in a deep dive for the years now into the nuances and intricacies of federal policy regulatory reform. And they're each going to speak today on this issue of, does broadband affect economic development within communities? I know that a decade ago, I launched a project to build ubiquitous wireless technologies and community wireless networking technologies. And this notion was just to bring connectivity to all underserved communities, not just in the United States, but internationally as well. It's a dream that I still hold. And we launched this endeavor because in our own personal experiences and the work that we had done in terms of community organizing, we had noticed that there's a dramatic, beneficial, positive impact of connectivity within both our own communities that we were working in, but also those that we were working with both across the U.S. and globally. And the digital divide was in many ways far more obvious 5 or 10 years ago. You know, you either had connectivity or you absolutely did not. And what we're finding is that today, what was clear delineations have really become a far more complex picture. And the disconnected and the connected is a far more nebulous construct. So today the landscape is both far more complex, but the question that we still are asking ourselves 10 years on is, you know, why is broadband important? Now, I would posit that there are 4 key systemic economic analyses, studies that need to be undertaken. And I would view Jed Kolko's research as tackling sort of the first facet. What are the economic impacts of broadband deployment writ large? And what he's found and documented in this incredible report is that the picture is both far more complex, but we've often overstated or oversimplified, I will say, sort of the causal relationships between broadband and economic well-being. And in many ways, it's far from optimal to be overstating this picture. It's politically pragmatic. But I would say that instead of saying that this is a simple picture, it's far better over the long term that we really experience or we really investigate these complexities, understand their relationships, figure out where these causal relationships exist, but also where they may, in fact, be mediating factors. Now, the Kolko report, as I'll call it now, is also, in many ways, lays the foundation for 3 additional key inquiries that all need to be undertaken. And for policymakers to make informed decisions, to really know what's going on and what the impacts of their decisions will be, they really need to investigate these 3 things. And the first is that we really need to look at the externalities to existing studies. And Jed rightfully states in the report right up front, you know, other benefits include improvements in healthcare delivery, access to education, energy efficiency, civic participation, and public safety. To date, the evidence on the extent to which that broadband provides any of these benefits has been quite limited. Now, what he's not saying is that there's no relationship. He's saying that according to the best available data, and according to the analyses that have been conducted to date, we can't definitively state that broadband leads to everything from telecommuting to better healthcare outcomes. It very well may, but we need to investigate what these externalities, what the intangibles are of broadband connectivity. Second, we also need to investigate the network effects of broadband connectivity. And it could very well be that many of the most important impacts, most beneficial impacts and aspects of broadband connectivity won't be seen or realized until a critical mass of people actually have access to broadband connectivity. And this sounds, in one way, sort of a little strange, but we've realized this in telecommunications historically. This is why we set up the Universal Service Fund. This is why in electricity we had the Tennessee Valley Authority. We have, over the course of our history as a country, realized that the network effects of connecting everyone to roads, for example, are so great that it makes sense for us to invest in these sorts of things, and the benefits that they generate accrue to all of us. And there has, again, never been a systematic effort, an in-depth research project to investigate these network effects. And third, we really need to investigate the opportunity costs of not deploying broadband connectivity. It very well could have been that 5 or 10 years ago, and again, Jed touches upon this in his report, that the impact of laying out broadband for a community was that you directly benefited. There was a meaningful return on that investment that was concrete and tangible. And today it may very well be that if you don't deploy, that the competitive disadvantages that your community then faces lead to worse economic outcomes. In essence, you are deploying in order to keep your head above water. And that is really important as we think about the long-term economic viability or growth of communities throughout the United States. So throughout my own work in this area, I've experienced firsthand the benefits of broadband. And I've worked in communities that have had nothing. I've worked in communities that have been very underserved. And my gut tells me that broadband and economic development are linked. I've experienced it, I've seen it. But what's really important here is that what's missing from this equation is the systematic econometric investigations to document what we suspect to be true. And that's where the Kolko report is really laying the foundation for sort of a new data-driven information policy. So Jed Kolko's analysis, I think, have profound implications for NTIA as it looks at ARRA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and the $7.2 billion that they're deploying, for the FCC's National Broadband Policy team that right now is drafting up, in fact, finalizing drafts on the National Broadband Plan that will be with us for better and worse for the next decade, for congressional representatives that are thinking of weighing into this issue and have a lot of ideas about what the impacts are, but maybe not the evidence to back up those ideas, and to especially local officials that are thinking about how can I best benefit my community when it comes to connectivity and information access. So I'll now turn it over to Jed to walk you through the report and point out sort of the key findings and complexities in the work that he's been doing. And after that, we'll have both Joanne and Ben give a brief response, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So without further ado, please welcome Jed Kolko.
So I'd like to, first of all, thank Sasha and his colleagues here at New America for putting this together, and thank you all for being here this morning. It's a pleasure to be here. We're here at a point where there is really unprecedented public investment in broadband. Although for years there's been regulation, subsidies, and in some places direct provision of broadband, all of which are public policies designed to help raise broadband availability and close the digital divide. As of last year with the economic stimulus, we're really at an unprecedented point of public involvement in making broadband investment more widespread and trying to close the digital divide. We looked in this report at the recent past as our guide for what is likely to happen as a result of broadband stimulus initiatives designed to raise availability in broadband. The punchline is this. The basic punchline is, first of all, places where broadband expanded faster experienced faster employment growth. This was a very strong relationship. The relationship is numerically large, and it's stronger in higher tech industries and in lower density places. And I'll explain all this in detail in a few minutes. It is also probably causal. And again, I'll explain what I mean both by causal and by probably. Yet the story is somewhat nuanced, and it's nuanced in the sense that while the effect on places seems to be very clear, the effect on residents is somewhat ambiguous. The main finding is in places where broadband expanded more, there was no effect on the likelihood of residents being employed, on their pay or earnings, or on their likelihood of telecommuting. This is actually fairly typical of a broader class of policies that we think of as place-based policies, and it raises some important questions about what are the goals of broadband stimulus or other sorts of place-based policies, and what might be alternatives that could meet some of the same goals. In the background of all of this is the question of what are these data and are they good enough to answer the question? And as I go along, I'll try to be very upfront about what the usefulness and limitations of broadband data are, along with some suggestions on how we might get better data for clearer research in the future. So I'd like to take this in three parts. The first is to do a very quick context around broadband policy and the digital divide, then talk in detail about what we found in the report about broadband and local economic development, and finally say a bit on what this implies for broadband as a local economic development policy, contrasting the current broadband stimulus initiatives with other types of broadband policies, and again putting it in the larger context of this debate over place-based policies in the first place. So as Sasha mentioned, as we all well know, universal access to broadband is now an explicit policy goal. It has been already for many states and localities, but at the federal level, between both the broadband stimulus as part of the Recovery Act last year and the National Broadband Plan, universal access to broadband is an explicit policy goal. The economic stimulus allocates $7.2 billion. Much of this is dedicated toward expanding infrastructure, particularly in underserved and unserved areas. And I'll explain what that means under the Recovery Act and how and why that definition is in itself an important new policy statement. One of the main goals of the stimulus funding is explicitly to boost economic development. This is part, after all, of a stimulus package whose primary goal was to help create jobs. And so looking at the effect of broadband on local economic development is entirely consistent with the explicit goals of the stimulus. Now, the National Broadband Plan, which the FCC is working on now and will be submitting to Congress in roughly 2 months, is broader than that. The focus is not primarily infrastructure, though that's an important element of it. The broadband plan is taking a wider look at technologies, strategies, and goals, and looks at the broadband policy beyond stimulus. Partly is a clear expectation that the stimulus alone won't by itself meet all of the policy goals around broadband. And so the National Broadband Plan is the broader, more forward-looking solution that goes a step beyond the stimulus. In the stimulus, we have what is essentially a new definition of broadband. This is important, again, as a policy statement, and it also introduces an important wrinkle in trying to understand what the effect of broadband has been. I started out by saying that to understand what's likely to happen as a result of the broadband stimulus, we look at the recent past of broadband expansion and employment growth as our guide. But the definition of broadband has ratcheted up. The traditional definition of broadband, the basis of which the FCC collects its Form 477 data, and basically all the public information we know about the prevalence of broadband, is based on a traditional definition by the FCC that was the ruling definition until the end of 2008, that counts as broadband any service that is 200 kilobits in either direction. Now this is roughly 4 times the top speed of dial-up, It's a little bit faster than ISDN, for those of you who even remember what that is. But it is considerably slower than what is considered the minimum speed for an area not to be considered unserved according to the Recovery Act. So the definition for unserved is an area that largely lacks service with speeds below 768 down and 200 up. Now that's nearly 4 times the speed that was the original standard for broadband. And the definition for underserved, a less restrictive definition, is to have speeds available that are 3 meg down and 1 meg up, 15 times the speed of the original historical definition of broadband. One of the justifications for this underserved speed, the 3 down, 1 up, is that that's the speed that the California Advanced Services Fund identified as the minimum speed necessary for successful telecommuting or working from home. And so this is clearly a major redefinition in terms of what constitutes adequate broadband from a policy perspective. One of the main points is that we'll see that places that were served by broadband, according to FCC data and our traditional policy understanding, may be underserved or even unserved when we apply these newer, higher speed definitions of broadband. So this broadband definition ratcheting up is both a reflection of what's gone on in the world, as well as a challenge because the data that we have refer to this traditional definition of broadband of 200K in either direction. These existing broadband data, the data that I and pretty much everyone else who's looked at these questions have had to rely on, obviously don't tell the full story. So the existing broadband data at a narrow geographic level tell us this. It tells us the number of providers in a zip code that offer service. Technically, it's actually the number of providers in a zip code that have a subscriber in that zip code, which may or may not technically be the same thing as offering service. These historical FCC zip code provider data do not report on speed, aside from that minimum threshold of 200K in either direction, does not indicate how much of a zip code is covered by a given provider. So a provider could cover the entire zip code or just a corner of it. Nor does it mention the technology, whether it's cable or DSL or something else, nor whether the provider is facilities-based or not. It means that the view of broadband based on these data alone has been at times misleading. In 2006, for instance, the data suggested that essentially all zip codes in the US had at least one broadband provider. And even back as far as 2000 and 1999, these data told us that the vast majority of households lived in zip codes with at least one provider. Now, if that's the case, where's the digital divide? Why is there $7 billion focused on helping close the digital divide if everyone lives in a zip code with at least one provider? 2 clear reasons. One, which I just mentioned, is that not every provider serves an entire zip code. Particularly in rural areas where zip codes are large and footprints are smaller, there can be large portions of a zip code unserved, even if there is someone in that zip code that's subscribing to the service. Equally important, though, is the definition of broadband has ratcheted up. So places that had at least one provider, according to this traditional FCC definition of 200K in either direction, may still be unserved or underserved if they lack providers that offer service at what are now considered to be speeds of broadband that defined unserved and underserved. So a better measure of what has actually happened with availability and a better indication of where the digital divide is requires a bit more work than just relying sort of naively on the FCC data. One way to go about this is something I did for some academic work, and that is inferring availability based on adoption patterns. Basically estimating how many people would have broadband in an area based on their demographics if it were entirely available, and comparing that with what actual adoption patterns at the micro level look like. This exercise suggested that in December 2005, roughly 85% of households had access to broadband if they wanted it. That's very different than the naive FCC measure that suggested well over 99% of households lived in a zip code with at least one provider. So this is at least one step in the direction of a better sense that there still remains this digital divide even in availability. Looking at the number of providers in a zip code, So not just the question of, is there at least one provider or is there no provider in a zip code, lets us see that there are more providers in places where, first of all, there's higher demand, as measured by the density of the population, income, and education, in places where it's lower cost to serve households, lower cost to install the infrastructure, namely where there's flatter terrain, as well as places where the housing has been more newly constructed and there's less older legacy infrastructure to build over. These FCC data, therefore, though they are imperfect in the ways that I've described, nonetheless help us see somewhat clearly what the diffusion pattern of broadband is in the US when we actually go to the detail of looking at the number of providers in a zip code. There's a pretty dependable relationship between the number of providers in a zip code and the estimated extent of availability within the zip code. And that's the measure that I'm going to rely on in looking at the relationship between broadband expansion and these economic outcomes. I should mention that data will improve on broadband. Already the FCC's Form 477 collection effort has been expanded. It now goes down to the census tract. Providers report on speeds as well. The ARA funds call for a national broadband mapping effort. Those grants are already being announced. They're underway. There are some states that are a little bit ahead. In the copy of the report that you have on page 13, you'll see a map of broadband availability in California, which shows that even among places that all have broadband service at this traditional 200K definition, there's nonetheless a huge amount of unevenness and variability, even among urban parts of California. Some areas like Sacramento have speeds of over 100 meg. Others, like San Francisco and Silicon Valley, the fastest speed is only about a tenth of that. So even as places universally acquire broadband access at a minimum standard, there remain big differences in terms of what speeds are available. But for this research, and for, again, all research that has come up to now, we don't have that data on speed at a geographically disaggregated level. So to look at the relationship between broadband and economic development, we have to rely on the FCC data on the number of providers in a zip code. Now, using these data, our research answers the following 4 questions, and Sasha already helpfully outlined much of this already. The first question, and several other studies have also approached this question directly, is looking at whether employment grew faster where broadband expanded more. But the other questions that we look at go beyond much of the research that's already been done. The second question that we look at is looking not just at the aggregate, but asking, was this effect different in certain industries or in certain types of places, both to help us understand how we might target investments in the future, but also to see what we can infer from these patterns about whether this relationship is actually causal or could be due to some other sort of relationship. Third, we ask very directly whether broadband actually causes growth. If policy to raise broadband availability is to have an effect on employment, the relationship from the past needs to be causal to support that. Otherwise, the policy can't replicate the patterns in broadband expansion that we've seen in the past if they weren't causal. And finally, maybe the most important question that'll bring in a lot of nuance to our findings is, if there's this relationship, and you already know from the punchline that there is, who actually benefits? Who is better off? And that's really the question that helps us compare the types of broadband policies that we're seeing today with potential alternative policies that we could see in the future. So to go back first to the punchline, places with more broadband expansion indeed had faster growth. There was a strong relationship. It was positive over the period that we looked at, 1999 to 2006. Places that moved, for instance, from 0 to 1 to 3 providers, the FCC lumps those number of providers together in their data reporting, saw faster employment growth of about 6.4 percentage points. For those of you who are used to other ways of looking at this sort of output, one standard deviation increase in broadband was about an 8% increase in the standard deviation of employment growth. So broadband did not by any means account for the majority of the differences in growth we saw across places, but it was nonetheless a large association and clearly statistically significant. Again, this was based on the time period 1999 to 2006, based on the zip code provider counts. The employment data were based on a uniquely detailed data set called the NETs, which is a micro data set of pretty much all businesses in the US. That's a longitudinal panel of the Dun & Bradstreet Business Register. It let us look in great detail, both at the geographic level and by industry, relative to data sets others have used in the past. Happy to answer more questions about these data sets later on, but for now, let me just say these are really awesome data to be able to use to try to answer these questions in a more detailed way. So this positive relationship was not uniform. It was stronger, first of all, for higher tech industries and for lower density places. Now, by higher tech industries, I mean industries that were either more reliant on technology inputs as part of their production process, so industries that spent more on hardware and software in their production process, and industries whose workers were more likely to be in computer specialist occupations. So these are two different ways of measuring high-tech industries. Regardless how you measure, those high-tech industries more likely to see a positive effect on employment from broadband expansion in their areas. The other reason why we might see this effect for these types of industries is they tend to be more footloose. Lots of consumer services need to be where their customers are. They can't pick up and move because costs are lower or infrastructure is better elsewhere. Whereas a lot of these high-tech industries are more footloose, and they do have the mobility to relocate if there's a location that suddenly improves its infrastructure or other amenities. So that's a second reason why we see this effect stronger in high-tech industries. We also see this effect stronger in low-density places. In other words, the relationship between broadband expansion and employment growth was stronger in lower-density places, which is consistent with the theory that broadband allows smaller or more isolated places to take greater advantage of markets elsewhere by being connected virtually, even in the absence of those being connected physically. What I did not find support for was this early myth that the sort of idyllic vacation spots would be the main beneficiaries of broadband. Back in the early mid-90s, there were lots of sort of popular articles that we would all be like trading stocks, on our yacht off Nantucket or, from our cabin in Jackson Hole. That broadband would enable us to move to the places that we all really actually wanted to live, as opposed to the cities that we live in. There's actually no evidence for that. So places that we think of as unusually desirable, places with lots of recreation or vacation homes, the effect there was no bigger than other low-density places. So this is really about lower-density places being more connected to broader markets, not so much about people being able to move to vacation spots and stay connected virtually. To give you a bit more detail on the industries that were most affected, and there's a chart just like this in the report so you can see that more clearly. Industries like the utility industry, professional, scientific, and technical services, finance and insurance were among the ones whose employment grew most when broadband expanded in their area. Again, these tend to be both high-tech and more mobile, more footloose industries. Those with almost no effect, public administration, so government employment, arts, entertainment, recreation, and educational services tend to be industries with fewer high-tech inputs, and also industries that tend to be less mobile. They also tend to be industries where the expansion of broadband could hurt local providers. So if when broadband expands in an area, people choose to buy books online rather than at their local bookseller, or download content instead of going to the local record store or movie theater, those types of businesses could actually be hurt by the expansion of broadband into an area, and we see that the effect of broadband on employment is lower in those types of industries. Now let me talk for a minute about causality. I mean, there's been this crucial question of whether broadband actually causes employment growth. This is crucial for the policy question. In the absence of causality, policies to expand broadband would not raise employment because it wouldn't be mimicking a causal relationship that we'd seen from the past. So the evidence we see in favor of causality are these. First of all, broadband providers appeared not to target already growing areas when they expanded their service over this time period. And so just looking at the temporal causality, seeing which followed which, there's more evidence for broadband expansion happening first and then employment growth rather than the other way around. So that's the first sort of suggestive evidence of causality. The second is thinking about what would be the most plausible alternative to the causal story that broadband expansion causes employment growth. I think the most plausible alternative would involve population growth. This plausible alternative runs like this. Population grows somewhere. Broadband providers expand their services because there's more demand from local residents. And employment grows because lots of businesses serve local populations. We think of restaurants and retail and so on. For that to be true, we would expect to see the strongest relationship between broadband expansion and employment growth in those industries that primarily serve local customers. But those aren't the industries where we saw the strongest effect on the previous slide. The industries where we saw the strongest effect are those that tend to serve national or global markets, not those that are dependent on the local population. So that's pretty strong evidence that population is not driving this relationship that we see between broadband expansion and employment growth. Finally, the best test, according to us economists, is to use what's called an instrumental variable strategy. And those of you who know what that is, you are nodding. The rest of you, I will spare you any unpleasant flashbacks to classes you may have taken that mentioned this long ago. I will just tell you that using slope of land as a proxy for where broadband expanded, since slope isn't subject to any sort of policy or human decisions, it is given by nature, suggests that the relationship remains causal, though the evidence for that is somewhat weaker. And I'll refer you to the technical appendix for those who want more of the gritty details on that. The final question is, given this positive relationship that, as I said, is probably causal, I'm referring to this as tentatively appearing to cause growth, who actually benefits? And here's really where I think the twist is. Even though we see this positive effect of broadband on employment growth, there was no effect of broadband expansion on either residents' employment rate, that is, the likelihood of residents to be employed, nor on their earnings or wages. So how can this be? This can be because the American population is quite mobile. People move or commute across county lines to jobs. And what appears to happen here is that as broadband helps expand employment opportunities in a region, the labor supply expands there as well. People move to take advantage of these employment opportunities and compete with original residents for these jobs. This expansion in the labor supply naturally keeps the employment rate from going up more than it does, and prevents wages or earnings from rising rapidly. And it turns out that the increase in the working age population in these areas where broadband expanded more is just enough to fully offset the effect on employment, such that the result for residents is no change in the employment rate, that is the likelihood of their being employed, or on earnings or wages. That doesn't mean that there is no effect. In a world where broadband expansion or any other sort of local investment raises both employment and population in this way, plausible effects include increased property values, capitalization of this additional infrastructure into land values, as well as an expansion of the tax base. Residents who are property owners, residents who consume public services funded by the growing tax base, benefit, though not in the direct way that we might have expected residents to benefit from the employment growth through the labor market. And so in that sense, the growth has ambiguous effect on residents. In fact, there may actually be residents who would be hurt economically by the expansion of broadband, since if their labor market opportunities don't improve and they are renters, it could be that the combination of the lack of increased employment opportunities for them and the rising property values of the capitalization of this infrastructure into land values makes it more expensive for them to rent without getting the economic benefits in the labor market. Now, of course, there are lots of other benefits of broadband that are plausible, but on the economic side, there are some people for whom the effects could be ambiguous. The last result I want to mention is no effect on telecommuting or other sorts of home-based work. And for this, I relied on individual level data from Forrester Research, where people reported for their household whether they themselves telecommute, bring work home occasionally, or run a home-based business. And there was no effect of the expansion of broadband in a person's zip code and their likelihood of any of these home-based work activities. Now, I think there are a couple of reasons behind this. One is certainly that there are a lot of corporate cultures that are still not fully comfortable with telecommuting, concerns both with monitoring workers as well as workers' own concerns about being out of touch. The other reason, though, goes back to the data limitations. The broadband data that we have available to us go down to speeds that are much slower than what we now know today to be required for adequate telecommuting. So no wonder that having broadband expansion by that old definition of broadband isn't sufficient to result in an increase in telecommuting in those areas. Were there better broadband data going forward to see what the actual speeds were in different regions, I'd more expect to find a relationship on telecommuting in the future. So what does this all mean for local economic development policy? The first point is that closing today's digital divide is complicated. When we talk about the ambiguous effect on residents, this is actually a sort of classic finding of place-based policies. Place-based policies are those whose benefits are targeted toward places, not toward individual households or businesses. Lots of examples of this: road spending, programs like the Enterprise Zone program. These are all geographically defined benefits for which all residents benefit, regardless of whether the people within that area are needy. So place-based policies benefit needy places, which include some people who aren't needy, and don't benefit people who are needy who don't live in needy places. And it's a classic finding about many place-based policies that the benefits accrue primarily to landowners or other owners of fixed capital than to residents who can be mobile. Now, it may be a policy goal to help places. And when we think about basic infrastructure and acknowledge the fact that there are lots of people who aren't mobile and will be in places even if those places are less economically sustainable, then we may decide that it is a valid policy goal to help places even though that's not the most direct way to help individuals. It then begs the broader question of, do we help all places? And if there are places that are less economically sustainable, is the strategy to support those places, or is the strategy to encourage those who can move to better opportunities to do so? That's a big philosophical debate. This is not a debate that came up explicitly with the broadband funding, but it is a debate that any decision like this about place-based policies necessarily taps into. The other implication is there may be other important goals that broadband achieves that, as Sasha mentioned, we haven't been able to see those yet in research. Some of the hoped-for other benefits could be things like health outcomes, civic participation, public safety, and education. And some of my own other work suggests that people, among these different activities, when people get broadband, the one thing they do a lot more of is research health information online, look at more medical information. So health may be the most plausible additional social benefit that broadband offers people. If that's the case, we might think instead of simply targeting unserved and underserved areas in terms of the broadband availability, and rather think about targeting places that are both unserved or underserved in broadband and have particularly pressing health needs, taking into account what the ultimate outcomes of broadband are on the social side in deciding where public investments, necessarily scarce public investments, in broadband should go. So there's room for a little bit more thinking about what the right targeting is of spending money on broadband. There's also clearly much room for data improvement. As I've emphasized, the data that I and others who've done this sort of research rely on are the traditional FCC data where the minimum speed is just 200 either direction up or down. I also mentioned that the data collection are already improving, both with what the FCC is doing and with the mapping in the National Broadband Plan. I think one of the most valuable things, though, to help us understand what the effect of broadband on economic development and other outcomes is to actually think more about some of the historical data that already exist. We need those data in order to understand what the effects of future investments are likely to be, because our only guide for this is the recent past. And we know from other work that even though the FCC's public Form 477 data give no information about speeds or about technologies or whether the providers are facilities-based and only rely on the zip code level, we also know from some work that's been done using confidential versions of those data that there is more underlying information that could be incredibly useful in building in some of this nuance about how broadband actually diffused and what the effects of it were. I think that could help us understand better what the effect of broadband rollout has been on telecommuting, for instance, as well as some of these effects on residents in these places. There's also a lot more room to report on some of these hoped-for broadband outcomes. The broadband stimulus calls for better data collection around things that are inputs. What's the speed? What's the affordability? A lot of information about broadband, but not about the outcomes that many expect and hope to be improved by broadband. Further information about online civic participation, the effects on public safety, and so on would really help us understand what the broader set of effects of broadband are likely to be. The final point I'd like to make before turning it over to respondents is that all of these issues, even if they are resolved now, if we get to the point where there are no more unserved or underserved areas by today's definition, all these areas are going to come back. The digital divide never really goes away. And the reason for this is each internet technology, of course, has its own digital divide in availability. It depends on the technology. Technologies with higher fixed costs tend to have more severe geographic digital divides. The digital divide on the availability side for dial-up was small and brief, relatively speaking, because there were relatively low fixed costs. When we look at fiber to the home, there are in fact quite considerable digital divides already apparent, even within California. When you look at the map that you have on page 13 of this report, you'll see big differences, even among urban areas in California, on what the top speeds are. And as speeds increase generally, the applications and the content that people expect ratchet up as well. And so the speeds that we think of as adequate today, this 3 meg down, 1 meg up, may no longer be considered adequate as averages rise and applications advance. And soon we'll then be talking about the digital divide between places that do have access to 10 meg down broadband and places that don't. All these questions then about what's the role of government, how much of this should be supply-side supportive infrastructure versus demand-side supportive adoption will come up again and again with every iteration of technology. So even as this digital divide may close, new ones will open, and we'll face all these questions again and again. Thanks very much.
So I'm going to ask our respondents to come up on stage, and also if somebody could turn off the projector so that we're not up here blinded. Thank you. And you guys should feel free to either come up to the podium if you want to have a little bit more freedom to move, or respond from your seats. Entirely up to you. So Joanne, if you'd like to start, and then we'll go over to Ben.
I'm going to do it from my seat. Okay. Want me to go first? Okay. Well, thanks. It's nice to be here, and that was a fascinating presentation. Okay. Can't hear me? You want me to go to the podium? When Jim Ballard asks me to do something, I always do it. I am way too short for this podium, Jim. Jed, it is really hard to overstate the importance of what you have done here. As somebody who works in the local government community on broadband planning, deployment, strategic planning, and so on, this kind of analysis and research and bringing together of data is invaluable. And there's not nearly enough of it out there, and you were one of the first major studies, and we're grateful for that. I have said for a long time that if we had 50 significant academic studies in that were peer-reviewed and that went through this kind of a process, every city and town and county in America would build broadband because there would no longer be a debate about the relationship between economic development and broadband. And I think the conclusions you come to are extremely important. I have some thoughts on that I'll get to in a minute, but hopefully there's nobody who still questions whether there is a relationship here. The question is just what is the relationship, and not whether we facilitate it, but how we facilitate it as a nation. So let me start with a few thoughts. Economic development is, in the community I come from in local governments, the key driver in the great majority of broadband projects. Those that are in planning, those that are built, and those that never get off the ground because it's just very hard to make it happen. But that is the number one concern usually of mayors and city council people and county executives. That's why they're there. And in that way, economic development, very importantly, fits into a bucket of different issues that you actually summarize very nicely in terms of public safety and healthcare and so on. That Sasha noted are externalities. In our community, we think of them as the off-the-balance sheet benefits of broadband. When we build broadband networks, we have to think about the bottom line and what's on the financial statements, and we have to think about whether it's going to cash flow. Certainly the private sector thinks that, but when you have a public project or when you have a public policy, it's not the bottom line that really matters. It's the off-the-balance sheet benefits, and economic development is at the heart of that. The first thing that I appreciate that you did is to note where these data are limited or, in your very generous language, in some cases misleading, or some of the FCC's conclusions, again generously, have been misleading. My colleague Bill Schreier, the Chief Technology Officer of Seattle, which is a city that knows the importance of technology to economic development, Bill likes to get up in front of a map of the United States and say, that is unserved, which is a somewhat controversial point in some places, but it's almost painful to still be talking about even 3 megabits down and 1 megabit up as broadband. And I think that the really big questions and the things we're not able to answer, that we simply don't have data on, and that are so important is what will the impact of true broadband, of really big speeds be? And I'm not talking about up to 10 megabits down. I'm talking about a guaranteed symmetrical 100 megabits, which is just taken for granted in most major cities in Europe. Or a gigabit, which is pretty standard in significant parts of the Pacific Rim. And when we are able to answer the question as to what those kinds of speeds need for economic development, I think we'll have a much clearer public policy path forward. Now, our competitor nations and cities have already answered that question, because we know that China's building fiber to the home like crazy. We know that in Australia and in Japan and in Korea and in significant parts of Europe, there is unbelievable investment, far, far in excess on a per capita basis of what we are spending here in stimulus to build broadband and to build big broadband. They're not talking about 768 kilobits. So I think that is, in fact, I noticed my French friend and colleague here who can speak to that as well. Certainly, the French are not thinking about those kinds of speeds, and the relationship between big broadband and fiber in particular and economic development is one of the big unanswered questions that we will have to address. I think it's particularly important as we look at some of Jed's incredibly important conclusions, because something that struck me as I was listening to him speak is there's an element of what we might call the first mover advantage, or I'm paraphrasing how you put it, Jed, but there was a time when broadband was what enabled you to develop in certain ways, and we may be facing a situation where it's a baseline. to keep pace as opposed to move forward. We know in the local government community, and I think this certainly this is anecdotal, but it supports every conclusion you came to. We know that there's an economic development impact because we have seen in remote and rural areas what municipal broadband networks have meant for economic development. And one of the people who has collected the most of this data, Jim Baller, is sitting here in the room, and he has aggregated a lot of the data that's come out of these communities. But it is not a coincidence that the 57 municipal fiber-to-the-home and hybrid fiber coax networks in the United States are in remote and rural and small-town communities, where the drive for economic development is an absolute imperative, given the nature of our economy in 2010, and where it is easier to track economic development impacts. And once again, this is anecdotal, but I think what you were unable to see in this data, we do see on a community-by-community basis, and by that I mean the impact on individual residents and increases in salaries and impacts on the lives of people who already live in the community. And a couple of quick examples of that would be Bristol, Virginia, right here, 7 hours down the road, which is a municipal fiber-to-the-home network that has attracted multiple new employers that have built factories or opened offices in Bristol purely because of the presence of fiber that they could not get elsewhere, creating much higher paying jobs than is standard in that part of the country. I think that's one example, although we're again talking about much bigger bandwidth and to some degree a first mover advantage because so few parts of the country have that kind of bandwidth. Pulaski, Tennessee is another anecdotal example where the city there has actually contracted with the Department of Defense to store data that's created jobs right in Pulaski because they have a direct fiber connection. There's the aggregate economic impact, the economic development impact, but it's also an impact on the lives of individuals who have access to different kinds of jobs than they would otherwise. I don't want to run over my allotted time, so let me just speak quickly for a couple more minutes about what I actually think is the most interesting outcome of Jed's analysis, and the one that I am most troubled by because it's not the answer I want to hear, and it's and something that I'm hoping we will see changing over time, and that is the conclusion with regard to telecommuting. Jed's finding that there is no appreciable difference with respect to telecommuting as a result of broadband deployment is first of all counterintuitive, I think. So that's part of the reason why it's so distressing, because we so much hope that it would be the opposite. But I appreciate you pointing out that all of your data is based on much lower bandwidth than potentially might facilitate or transform telecommuting. And I think we all know anecdotally, and again intuitively, what broadband has meant in our individual lives in terms of that hour before work opens when we're working at home, or the hour between 11 and 12 when we're working at home, and that is possible. That was not possible 6 or 7 years ago, at least for those of us who have the kinds of broadband speeds we do here. But I think the real question, or the really exciting movement on telecommuting is again going to happen in a context of real broadband, of really big broadband speeds, far beyond what the FCC and NTIA and RUS are willing to admit as broadband. And that's going to be when we start to see the impact of fiber to the home and of symmetrical speeds, which is not always offered by our commercial fiber to the home providers on telecommuting. So let me give you an example, and this is not empirical data, and I wish I had it, and in a few years maybe we will have this. But the city of San Francisco is one of 7 cities that commissioned market research to look at exactly this issue in the last 18 months. And We did statistically significant, pretty extensive market research in San Francisco of both the business and the residential communities. And I think the most interesting thing to come out of it from my standpoint is that what the respondents were telling us was that big bandwidth was going to be really essential. So we asked residents, would you be willing to telecommute if you had the following kinds of services? And we showed them tiers of different speeds at home. And then we asked businesses, would you let your employees do this? Everything we found is very consistent with Jed's conclusions. Also, by the way, that you see much more, well, I would say parallels Jed's conclusions that there was an impact within certain kinds of segments of industries more than in others. So shoe shops are not going to have a big interest in telecommuting, but IT companies might, and so on. But what we found is that we were told pretty extensively that very high reliability and very high speed were going to be essential for meaningful telework. And so, for example, in San Francisco, 62% of the respondents said very high reliability would be a prerequisite to any kind of telecommuting, even a few hours a week. Very high speed, 30%, that was 100 megabits symmetrical and more. 36% told us they would need 10 to 100 megabits symmetrical. And 25% said that DSL or cable speeds, which we defined as 1 to 10 megabits per second, would be sufficient for telecommuting. Only 2% said that low internet speed is adequate. And all the limitations of market research are apparent here, and that people might have slightly different understandings of what they're reading, but I think there is an overall conclusion there, which is that in a world of DSL and cable modem, and particularly earlier generations of those technologies, we are not seeing the full potential of telework. And if it's something we care about and think will have an impact, we're going to need to take a lot more steps. But I'm sorry to see that we haven't even really seen an impact at all yet, because I would have hoped that we would be seeing, and that we'd be seeing something of a gradual transformation of work culture toward telework. By the way, in San Francisco, only 19% of residents told us that work at home was not feasible in any way, which suggests that there is a great untapped opportunity for broadband out there. And why is that important? Well, it's important in terms of time saved, in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of the cost of operating a vehicle, in terms of noxious gas emissions, in terms of the cost of operating public transit, and the cost of maintaining roads and so on. Even small changes in the amount of commuting, as you play the numbers out, has a really big impact. So it's a very important question. I'm glad it was part of your study. Really quickly, I would finish up by saying that I'm going to distribute the study really widely within the community in which I work, where there is so little really reliable analysis. And this kind of academic analysis is incredibly important as a contribution to this field, because the consultant stuff that is done, and I include myself in that, simply is just not at the same level, and this is the kind of authoritative work we need. But I think the most important thing I could say maybe is that everything Jed said points us toward something that hopefully we already know, and that is a key policy insight, which is that if broadband has a relationship to economic development, then broadband is necessarily a matter of government policy and government interest. It is not only a matter of how the private markets function and how companies compete with each other. It is something that requires government interest and involvement, and that includes at the local level, where local economies and people are impacted pretty dramatically by this technology.
Thank you, Joanne.
I guess I should thank Jim for setting the precedent of moving up to the podium. As a graduate student in public policy, I can remember my econometric professor very much drilling into me that correlation does not necessarily imply causation. And I think she would be very approving of Jed's caution in this respect. And I want to commend Jed for putting out such a very serious and rigorous analysis. It is not always the case in many econometric analysis that you have, even with researchers utilizing much more basic regression analysis and not attempting to account for the issues such as confounding variables and reverse causation that Jed did, that they make sort of these unfounded conclusions about causation. And so I would encourage you in the future, if you read such analysis, that don't take the cautious route that Jed has and don't try to sort of account for the considerations, that you should be sort of cautious and critical of their conclusions regarding causation. Trying the answer to the question of does broadband boost economic development is difficult, and it's already difficult to disaggregate the impact of broadband on improving economic growth from other factors. It is only made more difficult by our lack of data on broadband, including accurate data on all sorts of fundamental measurements of broadband, including availability, speeds, and prices. Those of us who constantly harp on this issue, this is the reason why. Because as a consequence, it becomes very difficult to make informed policy decisions without sufficient and accurate data. We are essentially operating in the dark, preventing us from even assessing a fundamental impact of broadband. As Jed's report notes, that the FCC data that he is utilizing suffers from a number of problems. It reflects subscriptions, not availability, which can tend to understate the availability of broadband in certain areas. The zip codes cover larger geographic areas than is likely some of the providers' footprints. Data includes providers for residential and businesses with no sort of way to distinguish between the two. And the zip code data includes no information on technology, price, or speed of the service, which again is really important for understanding geographical differences in broadband markets. Some of these issues have been corrected within the FCC's new Form 477. We now have a case where 200 kilobits per second is no longer considered broadband. We now have at least an improvement up to 768. Whether that's sufficient is certainly debatable. The FCC is now collecting data on upload and download speeds, which, for purposes of economic growth and development, businesses rely both on the download and upload speeds. It's as important for them to be able to get data out of their connection as it is bringing data in. And ISPs will now be required to report numbers of subscribers at the census block level, which is extremely important for additional research on broadband for other externalities that can be utilized with combining existing census data, which is again at the census tract level. We're also, national policy is moving forward through the ARA stimulus funding on a national broadband map. We will likely be getting some better data on this, on availability of actual infrastructure, on the costs, etc. But again, this is just going to be a snapshot. There are certain mechanisms that it may be updated within, on a biannual basis, but it's not exactly clear that there's going to be a mechanism in place to have and to ensure that this data is going to be continued to be collected. And so that kind of longitudinal data over a very long time is really critical to developing an accurate analysis of the effect of broadband. We also will have some useful data points with the BTOP stimulus projects. We have a clear case where you have a treatment and control groups, and within that, those requirements, there are specific data reporting requirements on sort of the benefits, etc. So we will have some useful data coming from that, which should sort of help create some more analysis. However, without a clear sort of and consistent and methodical collection of data on broadband availability, prices, actual performance capabilities, and issues such as reliability, latency, and other technical aspects, we are still very much operating in the dark on policy questions and struggling to answer questions such as those in this report. Despite sort of the challenges that Jed faced with his data set, I think there are sort of very important takeaways that are come to conclusion in the report. We know that broadband expansion is associated with and positively correlated with an increase in employment growth. We know this is positive, much higher positive relationship for industries that utilize technology. And we also see that the relationship is much stronger in much more rural and isolated areas, which those of us who've sort of been constantly advocating that broadband is even more vital for the very rural and isolated areas for this exact point, because they need the access to national and regional market and global markets, because they have to bring the markets to them, not because they can't go to the markets. I think that's sort of a really a good data point to have. I think what we can infer at minimum from Jed's work, as well as Joanne's qualitative examples, is if you don't build broadband, businesses and people will not come. That there is a clear opportunity cost to not deploying and to not having it available. With better data, we may be able to answer better what happens when you actually do have broadband. And I think, other issues other ways of looking at this too is also what happens when, as Joanne sort of has mentioned, as well as Jed and Sasha, what happens when you have very large capacity, and not just large capacity, but what is the effective price on that issue? So if you have a very large, high-capacity connection that is very affordable and cheap, how does that change the game? And I think we're likely to see that is going to be a huge factor in really driving economic growth in these areas. And I also want to sort of caution that I think when in Jed's analysis of looking at the effect on wages and the individual lives, that we should recognize that broadband is not a panacea. It's not going to be a substitute for other social and economic policies. It does not fully address economic inequality, issues of education, and so forth. It's one it's one component of driving economic growth and promoting economic opportunity. It's not going to be a panacea, and so I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're talking about the benefits of broadband, as well as discussing its impact on economic growth. And so again, I want to keep my comments brief, and I want to commend Jed for his analysis and for sort of starting a really, I think, important dialogue on this issue.
So we're going to open it up for questions in just a moment, and to get it started, I thought I would pose a question, Jed, to you in particular, but Joanne and Ben, if you want to weigh in, that'd be great. And in essence, this question comes from Larry Strickling, who runs the BTOP program over at NTIA, and Blair Levin, who runs the National Broadband Plan team. And when I've met with them, they've asked me, what should we be doing? We understand that there's a lot of limitations in the data. We understand that there's a lot of opportunities for doing things better. We're really interested in data-based policies. We're really interested in improving both the metrics that are collected and the research that we're conducting. So, Jed, if you were chief economist / grand poobah over at NTIA, what would you recommend for these two agencies in particular? What would you recommend that they be doing moving forward in terms of setting up these next iterations of econometric analyses? You can speak into the mics.
Can you hear me this way? Great. I think there are two things that are most important to do. One is thinking about the range of possible effects from broadband and really starting to measure all of the possible outcomes, not just economic outcomes that are plausible and hoped for effects of broadband. I think of course we have much better data on economic outcomes because there are lots of agencies that are regularly gathering good information on employment growth and wages and so on. But this whole range of other possible social benefits, be it educational attainment, I think health outcomes, the civic participation, public safety, some of these outcomes are very long-term. Even if we were to discover 20 years from now that broadband access had a notable effect on life expectancy in places that are underserved from other healthcare institutions, we're unlikely to see that very quickly. These are the sorts of effects that necessarily take a long time to see. So thinking about other intrametrics, whether it's about people's regularly checking their own medical information, keeping electronic medical records, and so on, thinking about sort of other interim useful outcome measures. So not just focusing on the inputs, what are the speeds, what are the prices, what's the affordability, but some of these outputs. I think the other piece is there will soon be a big gulf between the quality of the data that exists through the middle of 2008 and the data on broadband availability that will exist 2008 and beyond. Now, this is great for looking at any trends beginning essentially last year, but already last year we are fairly late in the diffusion process of at least what will be known as the slow version of broadband. And if we really want to understand what the diffusion process even looked like in a descriptive sense, let alone what the effect of broadband diffusion from the beginning has been, getting historical data, closing some of this gap between the quality of historical data and the quality of data now being collected, doing whatever we can to upgrade some of the historical data that we have so it is more comparable with what we're collecting now, is probably the single biggest thing we can do, I think, to help understand what the effect of broadband has been and is likely to be.
Very good. Joanne, Ben, you have anything to add?
Those are incredibly important points, particularly about outcomes. And I would add to that that as we collect these data, and I certainly hope that NTIA and RUS are going to require their grantees and their loan recipients to provide massive amounts of data very regularly, and that it'll be made available to the academic and the practitioner communities. As we collect them, we need to be looking also at different kinds of broadband and what those outcomes are in terms of speed and in terms of mobility, fixed versus mobile. And we can't be shy about saying that they are going to have different outcomes probably, and they're not necessarily all equal for the same policy outcomes. I would add one more thing about data, I think, which is that we are at a disadvantage. We did not collect particularly good data, and the FCC, in the form of Blair Levin, has been very honest about this, has said very publicly that the Commission didn't collect data and didn't do a lot of analysis in the past, and I appreciate their honesty about it. One thing we might want to do is look to Europe and Asia and see what they're learning there. And we're a little bit allergic in this country to learning from our colleagues overseas, but they're working really hard on this issue and they're spending a lot of money, and they have certain insights, and presumably some of that is data-driven, and perhaps some of that data should be informing our policy making, because we're not making it in a vacuum. We're competing with other countries, and our cities are competing with other cities.
Yeah, I would just agree on the BTOP data collection. I think that's a really critical opportunity there, where if we can create a mechanism to continue to collect that data, and particularly incorporating the basic sort of fundamentals of broadband, but also the outcome discussion, that we can really sort of develop, I think, a real clear picture of the benefits or effect of broadband on some of these outcomes.
Very good. Now let's open it up for questions. I saw there's a hand there. Please wait for the microphone before asking.
My name is Bonnie Bracey Sutton. I was the only K-12 teacher on the NIAC conference working with NTIA. Thank you for your report. I have a concern about broadening engagement. In 2014, minorities are going to be the largest part of the population. Education served by broadband would be able to change the way we teach, learn, reach people. We've got a digital divide, we've got a cultural divide, we've got an economic divide. 1/4 of black young men are in prison. So wireless and the use of technology can really, really change. I used to be the princess. I went to 22 countries sharing what we learned in America about technology. And now when I go, I don't say very much because, as they said, when I go to Italy, I'm looking at song and all of these things. We don't have these things. And so I don't even say what I do. We need to change the way education understands. And one other point that you said, I work in high-performance computing. I went from the supercomputing conference to working with the Tlingit Indians where there was nothing. There was no dial-up. There was no Kinkos I could go to get. I had to talk. So I'm saying we have all of these places that you're talking about, like in Virginia, right down in South Boston, Virginia, where they closed the schools, where there are people doing wonderful things, but they don't have broadband, so they can't access any of the wonderful stuff. We've got to get this done, and we need bigger speeds to be able to accommodate high-performance computing. And people may not know what it is, but they use it every day. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a couple questions in the back here. Yes, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that. I think there's general agreement that this is an absolutely important point.
Just one quick comment in response. Sure. We've been focusing today on the digital divide on the availability side. There are, of course, lots of other ways to think about the digital divide, clearly in terms of adoption, for which affordability is the main issue, as well as a digital divide in terms of the capacity to take advantage of the internet and broadband, even among people for whom broadband is available and even affordable. And when we think about different groups, and particularly when you mention some different racial and ethnic minorities, for some of those, such as the Native American group you mentioned, when we're talking about rural-based minorities, that's much more about availability. When we're talking about African Americans who are primarily urban, the digital divide is as much about affordability and adoption as it is about availability. So there are multiple digital divides. Different ones matter when we're thinking about different groups, either race, ethnicity, or class. Thanks.
I would add this is where technology and performance also come into play, because you can certainly have access to wireless or mobile broadband, but there are inherent limitations, both sort of capacity-driven as well as policy-driven by the companies in terms of what you can do with that connection. So there are also issues there that will have to be accounted for.
In the back.
My name is Sarah Wiedemann, and I was struck by Joanne's comment about needing to go outside our country and look at what other people are doing. I would suggest that needing to go outside one's own familiar turf is a broader issue. For example, the psychological research, which is peer-reviewed, which is quantitative, which is rock solid quantitatively, methodologically, etc., has shown that random web surfing by lower SES teenage boys, no matter what they're surfing on, it could be on my son's favorite game, what is it, something like Armageddon 2, or YouTube, or anything, increases cognitive capacity. It doesn't even have to be educational. It's just the experience of surfing and the interactivity of it. So that's a field that's right, it's a global field, but there is research right there to be very helpful. And another area is in terms of health care policy. I looked at some of the research on internet-delivered healthcare services. Well, it turns out that there are certain types of diseases for which web-based treatment is actually more effective than face-to-face treatment. So with chronic diseases, there's a huge shame factor. So, overeating, smoking, etc. And the distance the social distance created by interacting with someone over the web actually makes it easier for people to seek help and get help. And the outcome data shows that it works better. So think about expanding not just geographically, but in other ways as well. That's not a question, it's a comment.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Got a number of hands. We'll go back there, and then we'll come up to the front.
My name is Brennan Greeley. I'm with The Economist. I had a question for either Joanne or Jed, which is, you talked a little bit about municipal broadband. And I'm wondering, I'm sure the data isn't good enough to give a definitive answer, but if there's even anecdotal evidence of a difference in economic development between municipal projects and commercial projects in smaller areas. Whether there's any increase in or in competitiveness if the city does it as opposed to when a cable company expands out to a smaller area.
Just a very quick comment. I think Joanne surely will have more knowledge and better to say about this. I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of diversity among municipal projects, and they range from everything from wireless over a fairly small area to much more comprehensive fiber networks. They also range from projects that are very urban to those that are entirely rural. And so I'm not aware, I should say up front, I'm not aware of any quantitative research that's done a sort of head-to-head comparison of looking at a municipally owned or operated system, head-to-head, same technology against one owned or operated by private sector. But looking in the aggregate, comparing the two, you're comparing a pretty big diversity of types of networks and systems within municipal.
That's exactly right, which is why it's hard to answer the question. I don't know of any study like that either, though it would be really interesting. And when I'm done, I will ask Jim to jump up if he does know of such a study, because he might. What I will say, though, is that there are a couple of things that are worth keeping in mind as we look at whether there might be a difference. So the first thing is that with a municipal or a county network, there is not a profit imperative. The drivers are completely different. It's all these externalities, or what I call these off-the-balance sheet benefits, that drive the network. So the choices as to what services are offered and what price they're offered at will frequently be driven by these outcomes rather than the bottom line for a company located on the other side of the country. And that, in and of itself, we may find has an outcome. So, for example, it is not easy to get symmetrical speeds from commercial carriers because they're in the business of selling us stuff for us to download. They're not really that much in the business of us uploading stuff. Local governments don't necessarily have the same commercial drivers, and they may make different decisions about symmetrical speeds because they want to encourage things like interactive education or distributed development, home-based business, and so on. That's one thing we might want to look at. The other thing that I think is really important is that sometimes we have a range of different kinds of models and locations, as Jed said, and most of the fiber to the home municipal networks are in rural and small town areas where there was little or no competition when they first went to market, but some are in areas where there is competition. So one place that comes to mind is a municipal hybrid fiber coax network in Tacoma, Washington. And that is probably a place where the private sector would have thought twice before trying to compete, because there is frequently, certainly within the world of phone companies or within the world of cable companies, they don't compete with their brethren. We don't see phone companies overbuilding each other or cable companies overbuilding each other. And yet competition in Tacoma has had an enormous impact on prices. And if we assume that the pricing has an impact on use and adoption and outcomes, that has really meant something. But I'm sure these numbers change from year to year, but at one point Tacoma reported that cable rates in Tacoma were, across the board from all providers, including their commercial provider, were 40% lower than just across the municipal border into Seattle, where there's not the same kind of competition. So municipalities potentially also can bring competition where the private sector is not interested in stepping, or where there's less of a profit motive for the private sector because there's already somebody providing service. So those are a few thoughts on that.
Very good. Let's go up front here.
Hi, my name is Sam DuPont. I'm with NDN, another think tank in the neighborhood. And I found myself more agreeing with points made by Joanne, and here's why. I was at the World Bank yesterday for a conversation about bringing broadband to libraries in Romania. But more generally, what we were talking about was how we can most effectively and efficiently deliver broadband to the developing world, how we can bring broadband to places like Bolivia and Zambia and China. And you talk about in your report how you don't necessarily see growth in wages or growth in employment. It's correlated but not necessarily causal. But I don't think that's necessarily surprising when you know that every parent in India and China is giving up everything they can to get their kids on the internet. That Finland just made 1 megabit download speeds a essentially constitutional right. I mean, we're not competing really in the 20th century. It's a different world. It's more competitive, and so I think we can't really see broadband as this great advantage that we're hopefully delivering to people in rural areas. I think we have to see not having it as a catastrophic disadvantage. And so I'll bring this to a question. I think rather than looking back at the past 10 years and putting in the data and see what kind of, see whether it moves the needle, I think it's more instructive to look forward 10 or 20 years and to ask if we can imagine, any child today succeeding in life without access to broadband. If anybody in this room would offer up their own children for such an experiment, or if anybody in this room would themselves, give up broadband for even a week. It seems to me that's sort of more the question.
You guys want to comment on that? I love the idea of, make your kids the control group. if you think that broadband is not important. That's, yeah, a powerful statement.
It's an interesting point about the future-looking analysis, there's no question, but the empirical analysis and research is absolutely essential. And it goes back to what I said at the beginning of my comments about the value of what Jed's done, is that we need to, in my opinion, be making really significant public investment at the federal, state, and local level, and we're not seeing it at the level we should. Local governments have been at the forefront of this for 15 years, but we haven't had a federal partner until the past year. And now there's a partnership there, but I wouldn't consider it incredibly robust. Our competitor nations have much more significant investments at their central government level working with their localities. And France is a good example of that, but there are lots of others. We have not been making those kinds of investments, and I am hopeful that with more of this kind of analysis of what limited data we have as the link to economic development and frankly our economic future as a nation becomes clear, it will provide some impetus toward more of that kind of investment. And that's why it's really important. And as I said, at the local level where communities are thinking about making local investments, they have to be able to show that there are these off-the-balance sheet benefits. And this is part of showing that. And it's sad how few studies there are that have really gone through this analysis. Not that people have come to opposite conclusions, but there's just very little research and analysis of the sort that Jed has done out there, and we need a lot more.
I think it's very important to understand what the vision is that we, whether we means this country or the world, imagine 10 or 20 years from now and what we hope the endpoint looks like. But I think the importance of looking at the work that we've done and what has happened is crucial in understanding how to get from here to there, and understanding the types of policies that have been used and the way diffusion has already happened, and what benefits that did or didn't bring is crucial in understanding how to weigh all the different possible paths from getting from where we are today to whatever the vision of the future is, even with complete agreement about what the future vision is. There's a wide range of possible policy responses to get us from here to there. For example, The policy response that we have right now in the broadband stimulus is very focused on the supply side, on expanding infrastructure to underserved areas. We can easily imagine two alternative types of approaches. One might be focusing much more on the demand side, subsidizing adoption, targeting individuals or businesses rather than places. A second alternative might be focusing not so much as we are now on the later stage of diffusion of an existing technology, but instead to make lots of public investments at the early stage of a next generation technology. And the bulk of the broadband stimulus is not focused on that. It's focused on catching up underserved areas and understanding how broadband expansion has these effects at a particular stage of adoption tells us something about how we weigh each of these different policy options to understand whether they all get us to that vision 10 or 20 years from now, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each. I think it's much easier to have the vision and to come to consensus on that, but I think we actually need to look to lessons to understand what are the paths to get there, and where are the pitfalls. Often policies don't have their intended effects, and everyone can look theoretically and have the right expectation about what a policy should have. But we all know that lots of policies, and in particular the sorts of place-based policies that we've been talking about today, may have effects that are different than what are expected. But it's also highly contextual. There's no reason to think that the effect of broadband expansion at the later stage of broadband diffusion in a rich country will be exactly mimicked by investments in broadband in a much lower income country at a much earlier stage of its relative diffusion of the same technology or a different technology. There are too many individual factors, both nationally and in terms of the technology, to do a simple extrapolation.
Right, let me just clarify one of the points that Jed was bringing up. There are a few $100 million for public computing centers and broadband adoption sustainability projects out of the $7 billion in broadband stimulus funding. But he's absolutely correct that it's really focused on the supply side intervention space. I also want to concretize, maybe drive home the point of how little $7 billion actually ends up being. Around the same time that we were saying we're investing $7.2 billion in broadband stimulus, Australia came out and said, well, we're going to be investing $31 billion. And when you look at the population differentials, 20-odd million versus 300 million here, per capita that breaks down to us spending about $24 for every man, woman, and child, and Australia spending $1,400. It doesn't take a genius to realize, that's a big differential and probably will drive something different in people's everyday experiences of what that kind of broadband intervention means. And it's not just Australia. A lot of countries are building infrastructure, putting extensive amounts of funding behind these efforts, and we are throwing at best a token amount. We should be spending $400 or $500 billion on this infrastructure. And that's not even on the table right now. But there was a couple hands here. We'll go here, then Jim, then over to here. I'm going to take about 3 or 4 more questions, and then we'll close it down.
Hi, I'm sorry, my name is Jessica Milano, and I'm with the DLC, another think tank. And I actually had a quick follow-up question for Jed on your research. Jobs being sort of job creation, a hot topic right now. And I'm intrigued that you found a relationship between broadband access and employment growth. I'm wondering if you took that 1 or 2 steps further, and if you had done any work on sort of the multiplier effect of laying down broadband lines in terms of direct and indirect job creation in given local economies. And the second part of my question is, I know you looked at sort of the employment effect by industry. Have you done any work on firm size, small businesses, things like that, the effect of having access to broadband and employment growth or job creation in small businesses?
Okay. Great. So to the first question about the actual provision of broadband and looking at what's the effect on employment, presumably in those industries involved in deployment, and then the add-on effect of the multiplier, that's methodologically it's a somewhat different approach, looking instead at overall employment growth, which in effect takes into account the multiplier effect rather than by looking specifically at the deployment industry and then the multiplier separately. And the reason for that is I was particularly interested in looking at broadband as a local economic development policy, whereas some of the employment effect that comes from deploying broadband to a new area goes to jobs created for people who live elsewhere. I mean, not all of the broadband deployment workers will come from the local community. And so there may well be employment effects of broadband at a broader geographic level that aren't specifically a local effect, whereas here we're really looking at broadband as a local economic development strategy. So that's the answer to the first part of the question. Remind me, the second part was?
It's really hard to come up with a number, but sort of the number, from a policy perspective, sort of the number of potential jobs created by doing X, or sort of what are the impacts?
So one way to look at firm size, sort of crude way to get at the effect of firm size, is to look both at employment growth and the growth in the number of establishments, and look to get a ballpark of how the average number of employees per establishment has changed. Establishments also grew pretty much to the same degree that employment grew, so there was not a clear favoring of larger or smaller firms in the effect. The one thing that is worth mentioning, just because this tends to get much more attention than it should, is that the effect was not primarily about businesses moving from one place to another. And I think this gets to one of the enduring myths about economic development. A lot of economic development activity is focused on attracting businesses from elsewhere or encouraging businesses headquartered elsewhere to open up an establishment in your community. The vast majority of job creation and destruction comes from existing businesses in an area expanding and contracting, new businesses forming, or existing businesses dying, and that's true in general, and that is also true when we look at the relationship between employment growth and broadband. Overwhelmingly, the effect is from existing businesses expanding and contracting, new businesses opening, existing businesses closing, not from businesses moving across zip code or county or state borders. Thanks.
Very good. Jim?
I'm Jim Baller of the Baller Herbst Law Group and the U.S. Broadband Coalition. I have a question, because as Joanne noted, I spend most of my time at the high capacity end, and your research is very interesting at the other end, and I have a question about that. But first, let me really applaud you for your research for a number of reasons. The first one is that, in my view, this is one of the very first research projects that has, in a disciplined way, in a plausible way, addressed causality. We've seen lots of reports on associations from which we don't learn as much as we learn when we're actually looking at causality, and that's really important. And second is, I think you've done a great job in, number one, discussing the limitations on your research of the bad database that we start from, and also in pointing out questions that will benefit from further research. We're just at the very beginning of this process right now, and there's so much to benefit from doing the kinds of things that you and Sasha outlined before. I've heard from several of you certain threads that I'd like to pull together by expanding a little on the example of Bristol, Virginia that Joanne raised earlier, because it hits on so many of the points that have been raised here. And here you have a community of 18,000 on the border of Virginia and Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, where 10 years ago the whole region was failing, seriously failing. It was in economic distress. All of its major industries were in the tank at the same time, including agriculture and textiles and coal mining. They were all in the tank, and the people of the city of, or the town of Bristol decided that they were going to try to rebuild their community and their region through advanced communication services. in part, Jeb, as you noted, growth occurs when you expand local businesses and keep them from moving out, but it also does grow, if well done, by attracting not only single companies but clusters of entities. Well, the Bristol people talked about what a fiber network could do for them, decided to embark on such a project. After 3 years of struggling with the incumbents, finally got their project up and running. It is now colossally popular with take rates in excess of, or approximately 65% now. But most important, it is now attracting major businesses. 2 businesses alone, out of many others, are reportedly bringing up to 1,500 jobs into the community, paying average wages of $60,000 compared to a base of $30,000. Now, talk about multiplier effects. Think of what happens when you add 1,500 or even 1,000 jobs in a community of 18,000, and that new revenue is supporting the purchases of soccer cleats and haircuts and building materials, and that money is spent by those who receive it in the community, and it keeps going around and around in that community, ultimately creating new revenues, not just for Bristol's system, but also for the incumbents and everyone else. And so that brings me to my question. To what extent, in working with your data, were you able to get a feeling for the impact of not stepping forward, and even at the low levels that you were studying? To what extent could you see from the data, either as you were eyeballing or otherwise, that rather than merely maintaining job growth, those communities that were not stepping forward to a broadband world were actually losing jobs, losing population? Clark McLeod, some years ago, in introducing what he called the Opportunity Iowa initiative, would ask audiences at the beginning of his presentations what they thought Iowa's greatest export was. And after listening some, he would tell them their kids. And so to what extent is your data useful to those of us who could cite it to demonstrate, or maybe follow-ups would be useful to demonstrate, the negative impact of doing nothing?
There's an interesting way to look at this, which is it's slightly different from thinking about the difference between a job gained and a job not lost. And instead I want to think about doing nothing in terms of the timing. And I think this gets to another sort of running theme of, we're looking at broadband expansion at the later period of broadband diffusion in the U.S., starting in 1999, driven entirely by data limitations, and trying to draw some conclusions about what that might mean about policies focused on investments at an earlier stage in a diffusion process. And I'll explain how this sort of gets all back to the sort of doing nothing question. It is also possible to look at the earlier stage of broadband diffusion in the U.S. So looking at 1992 to 1999, we're sort of late enough in the morning that I can start telling you about all the things that I didn't tell you about earlier. And this is one of them. Looking at the earlier stage in the diffusion process, it's a little trickier econometrically. You can't control for as much because you don't have a period even prior to that. You can see all the gory details in the technical appendix. But the short outcome is that when we look at the earlier period of broadband diffusion, we saw a similar effect on employment growth, but we actually see a positive effect on average earnings and wages in those areas where broadband expanded in the early phase. Now, again, we don't emphasize this for 2 reasons. One is that there are a lot of things one can't control for in the early period. The second is that's actually less relevant for the immediate policy question, because the main policy debate right now is about broadband stimulus, which is designed toward helping places catch up toward the end rather than places be first movers at the beginning of the diffusion process. But when you look at that first period, you do see a stronger effect on earnings, income, and wages. And it suggests that one of the ways of thinking about the cost of doing nothing is not literally doing nothing, but rather waiting from a first stage of diffusion to a second stage of diffusion. And comparing these two time periods gives us some evidence that there were some benefits of broadband diffusion in the earlier period to localities where expansion did happen that didn't accrue in the more recent period, this 1996 to 2000 period that's the focus, in areas where the main time of broadband expansion was then. So that's sort of how I frame this question of, what's the cost of doing nothing?
What about the communities that would fall within the definition of unserved or underserved? Is there anything about the data available that can be associated with those communities that would give us some insights into what happens in unserved or underserved communities in terms of job losses, other economic indicators of success or lack of success?
Mm-hmm. It's possible to look at them very directly. What is difficult is we don't actually even have the data today publicly to do a sort of broad-scale identification of the unserved and underserved communities. Communities themselves that are applying for stimulus grants need to do this to make the case that they are unserved or underserved, but the data still don't exist in a national sense for us as researchers to identify which are the unserved and underserved communities by today's definitions and see what's gone on in the recent past with their own economic progress. There's a lot of diversity among the communities that we think of as unserved and underserved. A handful are somewhat urban, a lot are rural, but it's a mix of rural areas that have been in decline for a while and some rural areas that are actually rapidly growing. And so there's probably a lot of diversity when we look at the economic progress of those regions. There's also probably a lot of diversity in terms of what the industry mix is, where you've got a mix of older areas that are declining that are primarily manufacturing. And a lot of those places, broadband may not make the difference between decline and prosperity. It may be a question of faster or slower decline when we talk about areas that have a legacy of reliance on industries that have long been shrinking. But there really is a lot of diversity in the types of areas that are unserved and underserved.
We'll do one final question. We'll go right up front here.
Thank you, and thank you for taking my question. I know that it's not easy when people want to go to lunch to listen to one more question. So, my name is Dave Chafee, and we published the report on shovel-ready broadband projects, and I wanted to add my voice to the chorus of folks who have said that they really appreciate the report and your willingness to go after actual impact of broadband on communities, and hopefully this will be a trigger to others as well. I had 2 points that I would like you to respond to, if possible, and I'll try to make these brief. The first is you had made a statement that I thought was quite interesting, and I kind of instinctively agree with, but unfortunately the FCC does not, in its wisdom, agree with this yet and is looking for more data on, and that was that adoption is directly related to affordability, and that's the main issue. And I don't think that they have at least accepted the fact that that's proven. So whatever data you have on that, I'd love to listen to it and have you file it with the FCC. But more importantly, I think the research that you had developed was in the, I think you said 1999 to 2006 timeframe, and I think that there's been a much greater awareness of broadband and the impact of broadband since the ARRA and the broadband stimulus and the broadband plan have kind of been announced. And I would assume that there's some kind of impact when people start to become aware of how broadband might change their particular situations and how they might behave. And I was just also the other example was Verizon has rolled out, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of FiOS, 3 million, 3 million homes annually. And if that would be one point. If I was going to go to my employer and say, I might want to spend 2 days a week at home, and by the way, my FiOS connection is better than anything I'm getting at the office. Much better, in fact, in terms of broadband. Can I have these days off, or at least work at home? So, I guess the second point is, would you, if you would extrapolate, or could you, or extrapolate on these, say, last 3 years or 4 years to see how the results might have swerved a little bit from there? Thank you.
To this first question about affordability and adoption, I think it's pretty. The evidence is pretty clear that the most important driver of adoption among people for whom broadband is available. So, setting aside areas which people who are living in areas where broadband is not available, is income. There are big differences, considerable differences in broadband adoption by income level among people where broadband is available, which points pretty clearly toward affordability issues. There are not dramatic differences in prices in terms of broadband service. One of the things I was actually surprised to find in looking at these data for a related project is, although availability appears to be highly correlated with the number of providers the FCC reports being in a zip code, there's actually very little relationship, little general relationship between self-reported prices people pay for broadband and the number of providers in a zip code, which suggests to me, which is logical, that the competition isn't happening. Competition at the zip code level isn't the determinant of prices. A lot of large providers often have fairly uniform pricing across big parts of their footprint. And so the fact that there's competition in one zip code and not another doesn't actually have that much of an effect on prices. So given that we don't see, within a given technology at a given speed, big differences in price, the income effect is presumably pointing us toward affordability. The second question about the last 3 years and what we see in terms of availability and the digital divide, the case of California is actually pretty instructive. Right now, Northern California has long been served by AT&T as its ILEC. Southern California tends to be Verizon territory. Average speeds available in Southern California for broadband much higher than in Northern California. Now, nothing other than the provider's footprint could explain this. It's not as if there's little demand for high-speed internet access in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, relative to LA's West Side and Orange County. In fact, the fastest service in California and among almost any place in the country is around Sacramento, where ShoreWest was very early in rolling out fiber to the home. When we look, and this is not a new pattern. Years ago I was at Forrester, and I oversaw the consumer survey research at Forrester. And in 2000 or 2001, I noted that the highest broadband adoption of any place was Cincinnati. And so I tried to find anyone I knew from Cincinnati. Can you tell me, are the people of Cincinnati, especially forward-looking or, doing things that need technology? And, it happened to be that what was then Cincinnati Bell happened to be the first to take on the strategy of rolling out DSL. And one of the unusual things about the U.S. generally, and this is true then and clearly true now as higher speed and fiber access is starting to be more prevalent, is your access really depends on who your dominant local providers happen to be. And this is not a source of disparity that exists in many other countries, particularly countries that are physically smaller where you have a world of national providers. I think right now there's actually not a lot of awareness about this. I mean, even people, I showed this map of California to, are very surprised to hear that the highest speeds you can get around Sacramento are 10 times as fast as the highest speeds that consumers can get in Silicon Valley. If there's not a lot of awareness, then people probably aren't making a lot of economic decisions based on this yet. But I think as we see more rollout of fiber to the home and near similar services, there will be more awareness of disparities in speed, even among services that we call broadband, but offer very different experiences for some of the more advanced applications.
Great. So I wanted to give each of you a momentary opportunity for a pithy final point, if you want it.
I'm going to pass then.
That was very pithy. Thank you.
I guess just a quick thought about what Jed just said is that there's no doubt in my mind that what kinds of speeds you have access to has everything to do with who your provider is and with how much your provider values your market. And I don't think we're going to see that much more fiber to the home build out anytime soon. Verizon is slowing down. That is where the big impetus has been, and it's only been in what it considers its most lucrative markets. And if you are, unfortunately, if you are within the Verizon footprint and not in one of those markets, it is as interested in, you're not going to see fiber to the home. In fact, you might see that the entire network is sold to some other company. So that's going to be a key factor. But maybe another one of the themes, I'm not being pithy, but to sum up my thoughts here, where I am hoping we will see a lot of research very soon is what the impact of fiber to the home is, what the impact of real broadband is, because that is the $300 billion question that is all about our future and our investment and how we compete with the rest of the world.
I'm intending two pithy thoughts. We'll see if it works. The first is that policies that do a very good job at helping places don't necessarily do a very good job at helping all the people in those places. Pithy thought number one. Pithy thought number two is it's often very hard to extrapolate from the recent past, particularly when talking about technology, to predict what's going to happen in the future, but it's often the best guide we have.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Joanne and Ben. Thank you, Jed. If you haven't picked up a